want to introduce, I'm going to say, a returning guest, and someone we're very thankful that you've also introduced us to others. So thank you for that. We have the art, I'm going to call it the photography gallery of Russek and Scheinbaum. And today we're going to have David Scheinbaum, who's going to be sharing actually, today we're going to actually see pictures of a book that was published, and it was called Miami Beach, Photographs of an American Dream. So this is, you're having the firsthand experience of some of the pictures that are in this published book. I don't know if it's really easy to purchase that book. I actually looked online to see if it's available, David. Maybe on Amazon, there was like, you could pay, $100 for it. It's a resell, if you want to call it that.
It's hard. The book has been out of print for many years. And I also looked thinking somebody might ask that today, and I wouldn't buy them. They're too expensive, but there was a paperback of it, and those are not too expensive. So if somebody wanted to look, they could probably find it as a paperback. But yeah, it's probably difficult to purchase.
I think it'll be really interesting, of course, to see the change, from what it was to what it is today. And that's what I'm looking forward to in these pictures, and of course the memories that you bring with those. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can share your screen and begin. Of course, anyone who has questions, if you don't mind reserving those till the end. And like we mentioned, as people start traveling, and if you do make it to Santa Fe, once their gallery, do you call it a gallery or studio?
We call it a gallery.
A gallery. So once your gallery is open, I know that they would love to meet you in person.
Yeah. Yeah, just call ahead and we'll welcome you and show you. We not only have our own work, which actually we don't show too often at the gallery, but we show mostly other people's work. So you'll be welcome to visit us.
Yes. So and also, I want to mention one other thing, because I actually appreciate them, and I think people will appreciate them as well. There's a weekly email that they send out from their gallery that has some different things that you can learn every single week, that if you would like to join that, after this program, if you send me an email or put your email address, tell me you want me to share your email address with them, they can add you to that list. Yeah. I joined it after that last one. So.
Oh, good. And we've been doing videos in the last 6 or 7, but the first 25 or so are more like newsletters. And but especially if you're interested in the history of photography, that's what they deal with primarily. So do you all see this image? Have I done this correctly?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay.
You got a chai.
Yeah, got a chai. Well, it's a pleasure to see you all again. My wife and I were here some months ago talking about another publication, but what I'll talk about today is not just kind of my first book, but it's kind of the first real body of work that I did as a photographer. I was young at the time, pretty young. This work was done in the 70s, and it's a very personal work. Hang on.
Use your mouse instead, maybe like on the bottom left.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay,
perfect.
Sorry. As a teacher, I've always told my students, your best work can be done from your personal life. I mean, a lot of us, and including me, I travel the world. I photograph pretty much all over the globe. But the strongest work you could do is the work that you have an emotional connection to. This work is really about my relationship with my grandfather, and my introduction to working with elders. At the time, and I should say right up front that, I'm probably the age now of many of the people I photographed at the time. But at the time, I was kind of related to as everyone's grandson. My cheeks were constantly being pinched. They were constantly red from all the squeezes and hugs I would get from the people I photographed. But I'm going to put this up here because this is the dedication in the book. And It's the only time I'll put up a slide that has text. But I still feel that, you know, without my relationship to my grandfather, this work never would have happened. And he was a very important force in my life growing up and as a young man. So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to take a look at this. But what was interesting for me is, as I write here, you know, once after my grandmother's death and my grandfather moved to Florida, you know, and again, Florida was the place to go. And I'll talk about Arizona later in the presentation. But if you were from New York or Pennsylvania or, you know, Ohio, anywhere in the Northeast, you basically, you know, Florida was the place. And the senior community in Florida at the time was basically the largest Jewish community outside of Israel. And for the most part, it wasn't all great. You know, the sunshine and the good weather was great. It was safer than the cities. A lot of the older folks were kind of targets in those years in the streets and muggings and all kinds of crazy stories. So there was somewhat of a peace of mind. But not everybody had the ability to live in some beautiful high-rise condominium, and there are a lot of the what were hotels in the 30s and 40s turned into rooming houses, and a lot of the senior community at that time lived in those rooming houses. And my relationship to my grandfather, who was a butcher, you know, the images I had of him growing up was a big man. He always had an overcoat on, and he always wore his cap. And I remember the first time going to visit him in Florida, he was wearing like yellow pants and sunglasses and loafers. And it's like, who is this man? Like, what happened? So my whole introduction to this other lifestyle and how people were living was totally new to me. And my grandfather was literally a different person within a few months, and it was great. And he was out and he was playing pinochle all the time, and he made friends. So that's when I decided I was going to begin to photograph, because my feeling at the time, you know, again, as a much younger person, that, you know, this kind of community, what was going on was really not understood by the rest of my generation when I was doing the work. You know, a lot of people had grandparents living in Florida, but, you know, what did that mean and why were they there and what was happening? So this notion of a retirement community, this notion of community, many of these folks were immigrants. They came from Europe. They came to America for something better, and they thrived in their middle years. And, you know, now they were in Florida. And as I said before, some people were truly living this retirement dream, but not everybody was living this idyllic life. So, and I think, you know, you'll see that in some, maybe in some of these photographs. So I'll talk as I flip through. Some of them are ironic. Some of them might be considered funny, but not sure really how funny they are. And as I said, now that I'm the age of many of the people I photographed, what used to be funny to me is not funny anymore. So I have a very different understanding. Even when I was preparing this lecture, I was looking, and I said to my daughter, who was helping me with the PowerPoint, that, you know, the work is I have a very different relationship to these photographs now as a, you know, as a 70-year-old than I did as a 20-year-old. So anyway, you know, of course, you know, my interest as a photographer here was the juxtaposition of the umbrella shapes and forms, you know, the repetition of that. But, you know, the umbrella, for the most part, there were more umbrellas out to protect from the sunshine than they were to protect from the rain. So, you know, on a bright sunny day, you saw a lot of people walking around with umbrellas. So At the time I was photographing, Miami Beach was going through this change. There was a movement in Miami that they wanted to turn it into like a Las Vegas. They were going to make legalized gambling. They were going to knock down all the old deco hotels, all the rooming houses. They were going to put in canals so boats could move around. And there's a lot of controversy around it. But there's this very famous restaurant right smack in the middle of South Beach in Florida called Joe's Stone Crabs. And they were very politically connected. So, this whole neighborhood basically was slated for destruction, except Joe's Stone Crabs was declared a landmark. So, photographing at the time was kind of ironic. Actually, when my book came out, the owner, which was a granddaughter of the original owner, called me on the phone and yelled at me for like 20 minutes because I wrote a caption about what I just said, that they had this landmark status. And after holding the phone away from my head, listening to her scream at me, the final result was she really wanted me to send her a print of it. So I sent her a copy of this photograph. And I once went there with my parents, and she had this photograph proudly displayed at the entrance of the restaurant. But she still didn't like what my implication was, that they were declared a landmark for political reasons. So again, trying to, photograph a place, you have to have some kind of plan. So a lot of my book is based around a walk in the streets. I think the signs in a community tell a lot about the community, the store windows, the office buildings, the hotels. So I think in the next few slides, you'll see, some of these signs and and again, these buildings originally were built as hotels, and they, during the 70s, especially, many of them were turned into what you might call a boarding house or a rooming house. People would stay by the week, and they'd pay by the week. Some had meals, some didn't. My grandfather's situation was maybe not unique, but where he lived, you were allowed to stay in that building, in that place, as long as you could get around under your own power, under your strength. But it wasn't a nursing home. So if you showed signs of illness, you had the potential of being asked to leave. And my grandfather was somewhat threatened by this. And as I said, he was playing pinochle every day. He was walking, he was going out. But when he started to suffer from some illness, he basically retreated to his room because he didn't want the people there to see that he was failing. So it wasn't so happy, and I didn't really understand that. But when I did understand it, that also led me to want to photograph and write about some of the things that I was experiencing. This was the home of the local rabbi. I didn't photograph it, but I will say that the fountain on the right, that the water came out through her breast nipples, which was kind of pretty objectionable, even to me at the time. I was a little shocked to see this. I think these days you couldn't have a statue like that in front of your house. And as I said, I think the signage very revealing about a community, and kind of what's happening. I think this is a very poignant statement. I spent a few days on a bus. There was a free lunch program for elders called, well, it was kind of the beginning of Meals on Wheels, which still exists. So I would ride the buses and go around South Beach in Miami, picking up people, bringing them to the community centers for lunch, and then bringing them back. And it was great. I mean, people would just burst into song half the time. And I was surprised how welcome I was by everybody to come and photograph and be a part of it and stay for lunch and go back. So these were kind of friends that I made doing this project. I love the dignity and on so many of these faces, and I don't know, so many interesting. I had met so many ones. As I said, I was kind of everyone's grandson in a way. They loved having someone around who was younger. This is at a dance. This is there were a number of community centers. I would go daytime, I would go nighttime, see what's happening. So this was a weekly event at this community center where there'd be dance, see a bunch of activities. Then as I started meeting people, I would meet people, I would work, photograph in the supermarkets, I would photograph along the main streets, and I would sit on benches, I would go down to the beach, I would meet people. And as I said, people were kind of interested in why I was there. I was kind of the only young person around. And so people were interested in what I was doing and why I was doing it. But the people who I started kind of communicating more to, within this body of work, by appointment with permission, I started asking people if I could come to their home. And when I went to their homes, I would try to do a portrait of them and a portrait of their, everyone has pictures of their family on their bureau, and everybody has stuff hanging on the refrigerator in their kitchens. So I kind of would always do a portrait, photograph the bureau in the bedroom, photograph the kitchen, and sometimes photograph their view from the window. So there's a couple of slides that I put in here of some of that section of the book. And this is Mrs. Schoenfeld, and that's her home. This man, I was photographing at this hotel that's right on the beach. Everybody sits outside all morning reading the paper, hanging out. And then, like a lunch bell would ring or somebody would come out, and then everybody would kind of get up at the same time and like go in for lunch. And as I was photographing here, everyone said, "Have you photographed the chairman?" And I said, "No, I don't even know who the chairman is." And people say, "Oh, photograph the chairman, photograph the chairman." So I didn't know who the chairman was. And then finally, after the lunch bell went, and I was still outside photographing, this man, he woke up and he got up, and then he started rearranging all the chairs in a nice neat row. And that's why he was called the chairman, because he arranged the chairs every day. He was very sweet. He was the chairman. Then I started visiting the hotels. Now, to stay in a hotel, we're talking about a very different class of people. Most of the people, the photographs I've shown you so far, they're people who are primarily living on their Social Security. Their monthly Social Security. They did not have a lot of extra funds. Everything was in short supply. But if you stayed in a hotel, you're talking about a different class, and you had services, and people sat by the pool all day, and they would, get dressed up for dinner and have 3 meals a day, and they'd be by the beach, they'd be by the water. So this was taken at the Americana Hotel. This is poolside bingo. Not everyone's playing bingo, but that was the event that was happening at the time. Now up North Beach, an area of Miami, is very upscale. And so I would kind of walk in the streets photographing, and I look into this barbershop and I see this, and I was pretty shocked. And I'll never forget, keep in mind, I took this picture probably in 1973. So how many years ago is that? but I never forgot. While I was taking this picture, there was a young woman walking with her child behind me. And I heard them talking as I had the camera up to my eye. And I heard the daughter say to her mother, "What is that?" And the mother said, and this is what still rings in my ears, the mother said, "That is a human being." And it is a human being. That was a pretty big fella. And what's really strange is that he had a twin brother who was also in there, who I photographed, but I didn't put that slide in. But this is a human being getting a haircut and a manicure at the same time. People and their animals, people and their pets, you know, I don't know, in a way, the pet almost became something for people to hide behind. You know, I said I wanted, you know, I would always ask if I could photograph. But then, you know, if somebody had a pet, that's was the reaction. They would pick up the pet and almost to say, "Well, photograph her or him." So everyone was very proud to have their pets photographed. And this is up in North Beach. This is this is a more wealthy part of Miami Beach at the time. South Beach was a less prosperous area where those rooming houses were. This, I call this getting ready for Shabbat, because on Friday afternoon, basically everybody was sitting outside with their hair in rollers, drying their hair, getting their set so they could, you know, go back upstairs in the afternoon and finish their hair and get dressed up. So this was a common Friday afternoon, late morning sight along Miami Beach everywhere, both in the North Beach and in the South Beach. Everybody has their hair in rollers. So, does anyone use rollers anymore? I doubt it, but maybe. Here's, you know, you think about, you know, advertising to appeal to, you know, everybody wants, you know, rent to the Northerners. And, you know, there's people who were going to Miami Beach at the time from all over the world. I remember I was in France like 30 years ago, and I met some people in Normandy, and they used to go to Miami Beach in the winter too. You know, I mean, it really was even then a very international place. You know, it certainly had a very large Canadian population. And then, as I said, you know, people from the northern cities would come down there. But this was the condominium that spoke your language. Everybody was welcome. I think don't have to say much here. You know, this was a strange thing to me also, as, you know, again, you have to put yourself in my shoes as a young man who didn't really understand the ways of the world and everything. But, you know, growing up in the 60s, you know, there was a lot of freedom as a youth, you know, sex, drugs, rock and roll, however you want to say it, there was a lot of freedom. And, you know, that was the beginning. A lot of people were living together out of wedlock and all that. It was kind of a natural way. And in a way, I think for many, it still is. But not for my grandfather's generation. You know, I didn't know anyone my grandfather's age who was living out of wedlock, or even my parents' age for that matter. What happened when I started to realize in Miami is there was situations where, you know, seniors would meet, they would cohabitate, not only for reasons of love, but reasons for economics, especially in South Beach. You know, to pool the resources. And there were people who might have, you know, grown up with a certain ethic or a certain idea of right and wrong. But as circumstances change, those definitions were also stretched somewhat. So it wasn't uncommon to you know, go to a rooming house and photograph and meet couples, and they may or may not have been married, and that kind of wasn't common in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, it was purely a result of an economic situation. And, they had to settle themselves with it. And then, if you tell their children what they were doing, which was, and I had a lot of people share stories with me about telling their children how they were living, and not everybody understood this situation. But this was the home of a marriage before. We didn't have much business. This was something that fascinated me. I was starting to learn about prices, and the less expensive condominium, it all not only had to do with the apartments themselves, but it really was about the view. And the difference between these photographs left and right, even in the 70s, was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because the picture on the right, you see that little piece in the top of the water there? That was the view of the ocean. And if you had a view of the ocean, even if it was this big, and a few inches, it was that much more money, because you could see water. The apartments might have been not too dissimilar, but it all came down. So when these people proudly took me out on their terrace and showed me their view of the ocean, my first reaction was, where is it? And then they had to point it out to me that was the ocean. So that seemed strange to me too. As I said, I photographed a lot of the shops, a lot of stores. I would spend time meeting store owners, meeting people shopping. I would befriend people and take more photographs. As I said, in the morning, the man on the left is doing his morning prayers, and the man on the right is sleeping under his copy of the Daily Forward. So, everybody for their own, but you're sitting out in the sun and you're safe, and you're not a target like you were up in the north. You're not going to get mugged. You're not a victim. You have beautiful weather. It is a lot. And as many of you know, it's not something to be underestimated. I put this in for all of you, except for the people who live in Woodstock. But first of all, this was like 70 degrees. It really wasn't cold on this day. But I went down to the beach. This is right on the beach, and this woman's all bundled up. And I went over to ask if I could photograph, and she just looked at me and she said, I should have gone to Arizona. So those of you in Arizona, you probably made the right move. But again, it wasn't that cold on this day. And she was great. This is Label. This is a different story. He told me a story that his brother left Europe, came to America, and he had promised to bring the rest of the family, and he never did. So what he did as a young boy, I think he was 14 or 15, he forged a letter. He wrote a letter to himself and showed it to his mother and said, this is from so-and-so in America, and he's calling for me. So he wrote his own letter, convinced his mother that his brother was sending for him, and he got to come to America on his own. The rest of his family did not. But he never really told me how he was not proud, but there he was now in Miami Beach, 70 years later. Again, these were stories I was not familiar with that much as a young man. And the people I was meeting, the stories I was hearing, the life lessons I was getting, learning about the experience. There was some statistic in Miami at the time. There was a very active group. I'll show you some pictures later. It was called the Gray Panthers. They were politically active. It was the senior citizen equivalent to the Black Panthers. But the Gray Panthers, one of their slogans was, there's 100 million years of knowledge in Miami Beach that's being ignored by the rest of the country. And indeed, there was 100 million years of knowledge in Miami Beach, and everyone I spoke to had a lesson, something to teach me. And I know it had a lot to do with forming the person I ended up becoming. Card playing, big event. I'm sure for many of us, I don't know if you all play canasta or bridge, but certainly pinochle was the game. I don't know how many people play pinochle anymore. I was taught to play pinochle when I was like 7 years old by my father and my grandfather. But if you look at the accoutrements of the card table, it's so revealing. This is a very expensive hotel in North Beach. And when we talk about symbolism, if you look at the pockets of these gentlemen, they're packed with cigars. That's a sign of great wealth. A lot of cigars in their pockets, the way they're dressed. But the big thing is the card table itself. Everyone plays outside and it's very windy and you don't want the cards to blow away. So they have these elastic bands going across the table that hold the cards down. This kind of amazed me, like who figured all this stuff out? Then when I went back down to South Beach, I started looking for card players, just kind of to see the people's equivalent to this. So I started going on. Now here we look at a card game. You see the cards are being held down by fishing weights. You know, if you've gone fishing, if you look at that device that they made, and that what's holding is string on homemade cardboard. You know, again, it serves the same purpose, but it's the difference between, you know, the $1 million thing and the half price thing. But the initiative of everybody amazed me. Her old aspirin jar that's laying there on the right side of that table, that was used to hold her coins, her pennies. Everything's being used. Everything's efficient. It's beautiful. I don't know, you know, people who get arthritis in their hands, sometimes, I don't know, we all might experience this. It gets, after a while, holding the cards could start to tight, you know, you get tight. Look at what they devised there. If you look closely at her cards, it's two tops from like Tupperware, and she had a button in the middle and sewed them together. So her cards are in this Tupperware holder, so that you didn't have to squeeze your hand for the hours that you play cards. I mean, that still hasn't been invented yet. And this picture was taken in the 70s. Here's the male version. You know, you don't even need a table. You just bring your piece of cardboard and you just share it on your lap. But again, using string to hold the cards down. So, and these guys' pockets are not filled with cigars. So, yeah, my wife is here saying they live longer, they didn't smoke. This was a great night. This was a night that there's a senior citizens orchestra was celebrating their 3 members. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm looking in my book. There are 3 members over 90. And the man on the left is Joe Garlick. The man in the middle is Harry Rose. And the man on the right playing the violin is Eugene Klein. They are all members of the orchestra. They were incredible musicians. And this was a night honoring the 3 of them. And I would go to the concerts every week. Fantastic. I call this Saturday Night Fever. I don't know if you remember Saturday Night Fever, but this was a bus stop, like 1 or 2 in the morning on Saturday night. I had no idea where this guy was going or coming from, but I thought he looked pretty dapper. So as I said earlier, there was a movement in South Beach to demolish all the rooming houses. And what the plan was, I said, is to, you know, turn that into be a big tourist center. But what was stopping that from happening was they felt there were too many old people walking around. It was bad for tourism. So they started building projects in Miami City, which was basically across the bay, which was actually, especially then and still in a way, was quite dangerous. It's a real inner city neighborhood. And they built these high-rise, like co-op cities. If you're from New York, like I am, they built these big projects, and their plan was to demolish these rooming houses and ship all the elders over to live in these projects. and the projects were called Rebecca Towers. This was something that these active elders, the Grey Panthers, were fighting against. I mean, people wanted to be by the beach, they wanted to be by the water, they wanted to be safe. They did not want to go live in projects. In fact, that's why they moved to Florida to begin with, and they did not want to go back to that. So I spent a lot of time at those projects photographing, and truth is, the honest truth is, the people who ended up living there was truly the people who were on social assistance, and they really had no choice. They basically were told they had to move there or nothing, because they didn't have any means to get any other subsidies to live. It was okay. It was what you would expect, if you live in a big high-rise apartment building, but it certainly wasn't the kind of retirement that you had planned to go down to Miami Beach and live in retirement. But this was taken there in one of the lunchrooms. So that's probably enough said about that. These are just some scenes walking along the beach. This was an interesting thing, and again, this is what I mean. Now that I'm closer to the age of my subjects, I understand things very differently. But, it's if you go to a store and you shop or you do something, it is possible to forget to pay for something. It's possible to forget a lot of things. I forget things every 10 minutes. I forget stuff. So, but there was some terrible thing is that if somebody was accused of stealing or theft in a supermarket, they would put their name in the paper the next day, and that was the ultimate embarrassment. So there, you go shopping, there were signs all over South Beach about the kleptomania disease, which was nothing more than a forgetfulness, and there was very little understanding by some of the store owners about their constituents, about the people who are actually shopping there, and that was not a pleasant thing to experience. As well as talk about not understanding, there wasn't accommodations being made. I mean, how could this woman reach those bags? If they were just up on that pole, if, there's no way. Somebody had to, pull those bags down for her so she could reach them. And I think now we live in a very different time, but there was very little physical accommodation made to help people who needed a little extra hand. It would just be the courtesy of somebody walking by if they decide to help or not. But it certainly, a lot of it was not initiated by the stores. It's just waiting to be picked up. This is Abe Marcus. He was one of the leaders of the Grey Panther movement at the time. I don't know if many of you probably remember, I don't know, the Chicago 7 and the Yippies, the Yippie movement. And now there's this great movie actually that came out a few months ago about the Chicago 7, if you haven't seen it yet. But soon after Chicago, there was a meeting in Miami Beach amongst the generations, the Grey Panthers and the Yippies. And Abby Hoffman was going to come down, and there's a big park in South Beach called Flamingo Park. And it was literally a meeting of the generations. And it was the youth movement who was trying to help initiate political changes to help the senior community, especially in the South Beach area of Miami. It was really quite amazing, and it did indeed happen. So that's something not very well known, but kind of a very positive moment. The seniors who were very active, I mean, they were devoted to really making this a very progressive community. And they were fighting against the local city government for reasons, as I said, who were really just thinking about tourism, and they were not thinking about the lives of the people who were living there at the time. This is Mr. Horowitz. That's his room on the right. That's his kitchen. As I said, a lot of the rooming houses had this condition that you can only stay as long as you're able to be on your full own, take care of yourself. So it wasn't uncommon to meet people who spent most of their time in their room because they did not want to be asked to leave the hotel they were in. So things like this would happen, and not pretty, not a good situation. We're back to Friday afternoon, getting ready for Shabbat. There's some other friends, subjects, more stories to hear, more stories for me to learn. These two guys are weird. I've actually, I've had exhibits of this work, and I've had people come over to me saying, I know these guys. If you look at the picture on the left, you'll see behind him, you see that word women. These guys would hang out in front of the women's bathroom at the beach, picking up women. The guy on the left, he would be like the sexy one, sitting there with his Jewish star and his little bikini bathing suit. And the guy on the right, he would be like the kibitzer, and he'd go out and bring the women over and ask them what they were doing tonight. And that was their thing. They were the guys. They were just out there to get the ladies, and they were very successful. They were a riot. They worked as a team. Man on the left is Joe Stern. He was a sheet metal roofer from upstate New York. This is at the Shelbourne Hotel in South Beach. The woman on the right was a Canadian, what we call snowbirds. They just come down for the winter. They weren't full-time residents. They just come down for the winter for a couple of months and go back. Flamingo Park, that's where activities, card, shuffleboard, ping pong, handball, whatever your game was. I learned so much about shuffleboard during these years I was photographing. There's a whole language I didn't know, and code words, and all the people, for every activity, there's always a bench filled with kibitzers, filled with people who would be giving their advice, unwanted mostly, giving their advice, harassing people, yelling at people, making comments. There was a Cuban community within the South Beach, so dominoes was the game. And not uncommon to see these under a big tree in front of a rooming house, you see these big domino games going on. It was nice for me. I remember I went over to take these pictures. These men were all Cuban. And as soon as I walked over, all the talking switched from Spanish to English. And I was so impressed with that. It was a sign of respect, but also as a sign of welcome, that they totally changed to English just for the time I was going to be taking some of these photographs. Another group that should have gone to Arizona. Again, these are not cold days, but some people get cold. And again, I don't know, they might be your neighbors as far as I know. Miami wasn't for everyone. You have the breeze off the ocean, and some days you just get cold. So this is, I should have gone to Arizona too. I love the pizza blintzes combination, and on the right you get a little sense of the Art Deco. There's a whole nother subcategory of my work, but the whole kind of marketization of medical ills. Some of these health stores, doctors' offices were, attractive, to almost like a fair or a carnival. The signs people would make, the lighting people would do. That's the most elaborate blood pressure sign I've ever seen, and it wasn't uncommon, come in. And if you look at the signs in the background, the doctor is in. And who would go to a doctor behind a counter in a store? So the whole medical situation in Miami Beach was not really the best, but certainly a very big business. Janet's reminding me that the time I'm talking too much, so I think I'm almost done.
Not talking too much.
All right. That's the last slide. Again, as I said, it's all about the view. So people who had their hotel, their condominiums, you know, they had a view of the ocean, it skyrocketed the price. This poor woman lived out behind all these stores. I'm standing in a pretty busy street. This was her view of the street. So, you know, she would sit in this one spot just to have this little long view of humanity that would walk by this hallway. And in a way, you know, this kind of narrow look at retirement that was happening in Miami Beach at the time is somewhat a metaphor from my learning experience during those years I was photographing. I'll just put this there if you wanted to get in touch with me or get in touch with us. There's my email. As I said, this is from a book. The book is called Miami Beach Photographs of an American Dream. The text in the book really talks about a lot of the issues I'm just touching on. The text was written by a kind of a cultural anthropologist, a Florida historian. It was a phenomena, the notion of this Jewish retirement community that happened in Miami Beach. And as I said, at the time, it was the largest Jewish community outside of Israel and mostly made up of immigrants. And there was so much to learn and so much to experience during it. So the text really addresses a lot of the things I just spoke about in a cursory way just now. You know, but, you know, the book is, since it's out of print, it is somewhat pricey online. But, you know, there are, as I said, there is a soft cover, and those are not too expensive if the topic interests you. So I don't know, we could ask Levi, there might be time for a few questions if you have any.
Definitely. Actually, in fact, Rena already texted in the chat that she has a question and a couple of comments. But I have a quick question. Were all of those, other than the Cuban immigrants, were they all speaking English, or there was a lot of Yiddish and Russian going on?
Mostly Yiddish, not so much Russian. The primary language was Yiddish. And, you know, my grandparents primarily spoke Yiddish. At the time, I understood most of it. I really couldn't speak, but I had no trouble, you know, basically, a lot of my conversations had to do with, you know, wanting to photograph, and people would be asking me, why do I want to photograph? And then I would basically tell them what my goal was and to try to share the experience of what I was learning through my grandfather. So, you know, people, you know, switched to English for the most part. But if they spoke in Yiddish, I was able to understand a lot of it. I don't think I would now, but I did then.
Right. And you didn't see any of the deli style of what you had in New York City, or there was?
Oh yeah, I didn't put those photographs in, but there, Wolfie's, there's a lot of delis.
Okay, so they had that same life, if you want to call it the food stuff.
Yeah,
All right, Reed. Yeah, sorry.
A lot of traditional food everywhere. But I kind of try to stay today with the people.
Right. No, I loved it. Rena, you had some question and comments.
Yeah, one question. Are you familiar with the Blackstone Hotel in Miami Beach?
I'm not. Where was it?
It was about, let me see, I have the address here. It was about 3 blocks from the beach. Mm-hmm. And it was, one second. Well, while I'm looking up the exact address, it was a 13-story hotel built in 1929 and located at 800 Washington Avenue. Anyway, the reason I ask is because my my mother's cousins founded the hotel because the hotels in Miami Beach didn't allow Jews or dogs. And this was the first resort hotel in Miami Beach for Jews. It was very, very elegant. And my mother's aunt and uncle had founded it, the Stone family. And in 1938, my mom and her sister, as the poor relations from Germany, got to stay at the hotel while they got situated in America. And my mom met my dad at a refugee party, and they made a date, and he stood her up because he thought she was rich because she lived in that hotel. And you can find it on the internet now. It's a beautiful building that's been converted into apartments, apparently. And
It's a fabulous story. Thank you for sharing that. I photographed Washington Avenue up and down, so I would almost be sure I probably have pictures of the building, but it's not a place that I photographed.
yeah, well, I'm sure,
But that's an amazing history, so
yeah,
I will look it up.
I'm not sure when it converted, to little apartments, but the son of the couple that established it grew up to be the Secretary of State for Florida and eventually a senator in Congress from Florida. Had quite a career. Anyway, the other comment that I had was that my mom and her sister had a best friend. His name was Sadie Nathan. And she had been a beautician to the stars in Hollywood. But they, after the good times of youth, she ended up opening a beauty shop on Lincoln Avenue, I think. Lincoln Road, and we visited her there in 1960, and she was probably in her 80s by then and was living in the back of the shop, but was still styling hair. And I'm sure that land is very valuable now. If it's still, I doubt her. I don't know the address of her shop though.
Lincoln Road is now, well, even then in the 70s, it's a pedestrian mall. So it's probably one of the earliest city pedestrian where they close off to traffic and just have stores. Now it's very upscale, but in the day, that's where Wolfie's, that's where restaurants, that's where actually a lot of the ethnic food was, and that's where you would go for your breakfast, lunch, your bagels, and your pastrami and all that. There are a lot of food places on Lincoln Road.
I was Wolfie's was still there, I believe, for a long time. I have relatives. My uncle owned a liquor store on the Boulevard A1A by the Christian, what later became the Christian College by the bridge in Hollywood. And we used to go to Wolfie's. We used to go to Joe's Stone Crab. And by the way, if anybody has a yen for Joe's Stone Crab, I don't know if they still do it, but Durant's in Central Phoenix was flying in crabs from Joe's Stone Crab years ago.
Yeah. Not sure they're kosher.
Yeah, Durant's isn't kosher.
It might be time for maybe one other question.
Yeah, Deanna's actually from Miami, so she was really liking this.
Sure.
Go for it, Deanna.
As a teenager, I used to hang out on 10th Street Beach, and there was this character called Holy Joe. Did you ever run across him?
No, but was he anything like those guys who sat in front of the bathrooms?
Different way.
Okay.
He wore a suit jacket and a tie. He carried a New Testament in his arm. His hair was always messed up, and he would preach to us, especially the young generation at that time. He would schwitz all over when he would preach. And I can't believe You would have photographed him so many times, but we always go to the beach as kids and we'd look for Holy Joe.
You want to know something funny, Deanna? I just Googled his name and he comes up in the floridasurfmuseum.org. Tales of South Beach, the saga of Holy Joe. He has his own little story here.
That's great.
Sermon
I
on the
definitely would have
Sand.
photographed him if I saw him. Sounds like my perfect son.
I could share my screen for half a second so you could see this.
Yeah.
Let me see.
This is a clipping from the newspaper called Sermon on the Sand, and I can zoom in on that. Hold on.
He doesn't have his tie and jacket on.
But is that him?
That's him.
Holy Joe.
And look at all the young people around him. I could be in that picture.
This is youngsters gather each Sunday around the Reverend Charles Klein, 56, a retired New York and Miami Baptist minister who preaches to the surfboard set on the beach. He attracts an audience of 150 to 200, all of whom call him Holy Joe. So but yeah, this is an entire article about him.
That's great.
Wow.
So that's funny.
Thank you.
I'm so glad I watched this today. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love all your work. When I'm in New Mexico, I'll definitely be visiting. I don't know when that is, but
Yeah, well, God willing, it won't be too far in the future. I want to thank you all for joining me today, and it was fun to see you again, and thank you for letting us share our work with you.
No, thank you so
I would
much.
like to mention one thing when you had the guys playing cards.
Yeah.
And I remember this story that this group of men are playing cards outside, and Harry drops dead at the table. And they said, "Who's going to tell Molly, his wife?" And Jake says, "I'll go up and tell her." He goes upstairs. He says, "Molly, Jake was playing cards and he dropped dead. He lost, I'm sorry. Jake was playing cards and he lost $500. His wife said he should only drop dead. He said he did."
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to take a leave here.
Thank you.
But thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.